which will be moderated by Dr. Amita Bhide, who is the Dean and Professor in the School of Habitat Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences.
Okay, thank you all. Have a very, very good afternoon to all of you. And I hope that this session becomes equally invigorating and delving into, I think, perhaps even more complex issues than we discussed in the previous session. The previous session, I think, itself had brought it very home very clearly to us. What was being seen as a technical session could not remain only as a technical session. How so many of the technical discussions that we were having were so immersed and embedded in other realms, political, social, economic, and so on and so forth. And I hope that this particular session will perhaps make us even more aware of some of those embeddings of flood risk that we have been discussing in the previous session. Vulnerability has always been understood. I'm not talking of the definitions of vulnerability here, but it has always been understood as that uncertain kind of a concept within all the technical discussions always of whether it is project impacts or disasters or when it comes to climate risks and other kinds of risks, right? Something which denotes the unpredictability or the limits of control in terms of where project imaginations can go. So the rest is then explained by vulnerability. And I'm posing it only as such because there is a conventional definition of vulnerability. But that definition of vulnerability and the understandings of vulnerability are never quite mainstreamed into the decisions of projects or of developmental initiatives, and that often creates persistent vulnerabilities. And I think all the panelists that we have for this session are going to throw, I'm very, very confident, on the light on how does one use different methodologies, how does one outline different kinds of vulnerabilities that we see in relation to flood risk in Mumbai. Definitely, it's not just a geographical risk that we are talking about. No, that Mumbai in 2050 is vulnerable to flood inundations and it's going to sink and it's Mumbai at large. We are not talking of this kind of a generic kind of a experience, but we are, I hope, going into several of its nuances, intersections, and complexities. So I'll begin in order of the panelists which has been given to me and introduce them in that manner. We will begin with Kavita Iyer, who has written extensively on several urban issues, who worked earlier with the Indian Express and now works as a freelance journalist who also works on migration and other issues. I think the lens of a media person is always a very interesting one because it constantly traces public discourses and public debates. And I think having a studied media person perhaps is a little more rare. So over to you, Kavita. We will all follow the rule very strictly of the 5 to 7 minutes max.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Amita ma'am. And at the very start, I would like to say that journalists do tend to be very contrarian, and we do try to take things on. And I hope that everyone here in the BMC will consider my comments in the spirit of discussion and not accusatory. And I'm not making any accusations or, I mean, criticism for criticism's sake is never something to be encouraged. But I've been a journalist for 22 years now. And in 2000, I started my career as a print journalist. And one of my very first experiences of being a reporter on the ground was in the monsoon of 2000. And I was walking, I was in a bus, I was in a BST bus for a while. It was raining very heavily. And at some point of time, the bus could go no further. It was a BST single-decker bus, but it could not go any further. We were in Kurla, and the bus driver said, okay, we'll wait for a while. So we waited for a couple of hours, and the bus could not go any further. We were at that point that all of us know at Kalpana Junction in Kurla, which is always the first to flood. And I had been away from Bombay for 3 years because I had studied in Delhi, and I had forgotten what Bombay's floods were like. And I waited in the bus patiently for an hour or so, and then finally decided that I must get off with everyone else. And so I got off and began to walk on the divider of LBS Marg in Kurla, on the divider. We were walking on the divider because even on the divider, me being quite short, the water was waist high. And I was terrified. I was 20 years old, and I was holding on to the shoulder of the stranger in front of me and walking quite a distance. It's about maybe only 800 meters, which is the worst length. And once you're past that 800 meters, it's ankle-high water, and you can easily walk across, and traffic resumes beyond that saucer shape, as we all know. But those 800 meters, it took us almost an hour to walk across that length because it was very heavy rain, and the water was very high, and it was terrifying. That was my first experience. That was 2000. 2005, as you know, 944 mm of rain in a single day. This is not a kind of rainfall that the BMC can be expected to plan for. But the very same spots flooded again. But 2005, even if we were to say, is a once-in-a-century event. 2019, the very same spot flooded. 2017, the very same spot flooded. I have no doubt that 2021, the very same spot will flood. This is, as we were discussing in the earlier session also, that there are some spots which are chronically flooding, and somehow there is no solution to those. And when I went back to look at some of the projects that I had written about as a BMC reporter, I had spoken to BMC Stormwater Drain Department officials, project engineering department officials, and I had written about so many projects over the years. One was a micro-tunneling project which involved conveying the storm water into the sewer because the sewer was much larger. So this was in 2 or 3 different spots in Bombay, including on Western Express Highway. Then there was, of course, the Mithi River rejuvenation project, hundreds of crores spent on it. And till date, we don't know what is an honest auditing of those projects, what has really occurred after those monies were spent, and whether those projects achieved results. And if those projects did not achieve results, then should we be reassessing what new projects require, or should we still be looking at the same projects that we were? So when 2005 happened, we reported that Brimstow ad would be sort of dug out from the archives and polished up, and it would be a project again. It was a 1993 project. In 2005, we were writing about it. They were going to implement it from 2005 onwards. In later years, I began to see the newspaper reports. They began to say Brimstow ad dated 2005, because of course it was a revamped project in 2005. A lot of it had to be redone. But ultimately, we are still looking at Brimstow ad, which is dating back to 1993. And there cannot be, in today's time, business as usual in terms of projects not meeting their required targets. And nobody in Bombay, all of us being stakeholders as city dwellers, not as journalists, but just as people who are living in the city and who have a stake in the city, that we don't know what is the outcome of all these projects. I have a list of those projects. There were so many. After 2005, we wrote about a gazillion projects. There was something about a Mumbai Watershed Council. There was contour mapping. There was flood zone creations. What happened to all of those? And why do the same spots that flooded in 2004, 2005 still flood in 2019? And the same, what has happened in Bombay and what I wrote about Bombay in the years 2000 till 2000, say 7, 8, 9 or so. The same thing is now happening in our satellite towns. So whether it is Titwala or whether it is, all those rivers that are in the Mumbai metropolitan region, Valdhuni and, so all of those rivers have the same problems. And we are now seeing that the same problems that we had pointed out with regard to the Mithi are also experienced in a similar way, not exactly the same way, but in a similar way in these regions. And no planning for Bombay or vulnerability of Bombay can be assessed in a silo and should be looked at as vulnerability of the entire region, because all those people are Mumbaikars also. And finally, my last point is that when we look at climate change, we can't really be looking any longer at whether the city will flood because of the rain, but we also have to be aware that there could be habitations that are inundated in the dry season, and how vulnerable those habitations will be. And unfortunately, those are all habitations of the very poor people. And so what happens to all those people's homes and livelihoods when it begins to flood, or when regions begin to get inundated because of rising seas? That is something that I also hope we will be able to take into account. And I do hope that further stakeholder meetings will actually happen in these communities, because they are the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kavita, for really, I think, articulating two very important things. Number one, that vulnerability is embedded also within vulnerabilities of governance, right? And the accountability is linked to that. And that it is ultimately also poor people, not only in Mumbai, but also in the region. So we need to be very, very conscious. I think often we take it for granted that, I think earlier, Professor Punde had made this point that we need to look at watersheds as boundaries and not really physical boundaries which are created by administrative regions. But I think that is a very, very serious point which I think you are reiterating again, Kavita. Thanks for that. We will move to Sucharita Sen, a privilege for reconnecting through this workshop. So Sucharita is an urban designer, an urban and regional planner, and someone who has been not only conceptualizing things, but also implementing things for all things green, I would say, right? In the context of disasters, in the context of green and affordable housing. So over to you, Sucharita.
So it was a very interesting session in the morning, the technical session, and as ma'am mentioned, that you know, the vulnerability has multiple definitions. So these definitions are sometimes very foggy, generally foggy, and they need to be defined further. When we talk about assessment of vulnerabilities, there are 2-3 things that come into picture. That is, one is the susceptibility, susceptibility of the people. Vulnerability is associated with the people who are affected by a hazard. It is the susceptibility of the people. It is their coping capacities. It is the adaptive capacities, which together, you know, read into the vulnerability of the people. So, as we were talking in the morning, you know, the most vulnerable people are the people who have not had the choice to choose whether they would stay on highlands. They had to settle on the lowlands because that was, you know, that was what was available to them. Those were the spaces that were available to them. And these are the people who are generally most exposed to urban flooding. Now the question is not how urban flooding can be stopped or mitigated completely, because urban flooding will happen, climate change is happening, the intense precipitation events are keeping on increasing. There are these developments that have happened, creating water bowls and low-lying areas where developments have happened. And these low-lying areas would often be occupied by people who have had no choice while occupying them. So there is this question of now assessing what is the vulnerability of those people, and then how do we go about mitigating their vulnerability. So there's one aspect of looking at it from the city level and infrastructure level. The other is looking at from the people's angle. And when you start looking at it from those people affected by the urban floods, you realize that there is a wealth of data there. We are, you know, data short in many places, definitely for the technical designs and so on. But there is a wealth of data lying with them, because they are the people who have gone through those urban floods again and again. And there is a lot of social learning that needs to be caught on. And probably we are not capturing those. And there's a lot of handing over to them, that has to be done because they will have to live with the floods, and the state or the administration cannot be always be in charge of, ensuring that they do not face the floods. The floods are going to be there, the people are going to be there, they are going to face those floods. So how do we now reduce those vulnerabilities? By handing over a certain bit of governance and administration, a certain amount of decision making to them so that they can handle the floods better. Is also one way of looking at how do we manage our urban floods, which are going to be here, however much we try. The second thing that I also noted in the morning is that when we talk of urban floods, we talk about tide levels, we talk about coastal flooding, we talk about storm surges. This is about intense precipitation. You have no control over. You may have some workings around the rising tide levels. You may have something to do to mitigate, the coastal surges, the storms, and the resilience of the infrastructure are things that can be looked in, but the intense precipitation will not be stopped. Cannot be stopped. They will keep on happening as the climate change keeps on happening. And these bowl-like formations, the low-lying areas are going to be there, and the development has already happened. So now how do we handle them? So I actually would be presenting today the role of citizen groups in vulnerability assessment and what kind of alternative solutions can help us in empowering them in taking action, because wherever we have gone to the ground talking about floods and such, it is the people who have said that batao ab kya karna hai. So there is a willingness and there is a interest in participating, and this needs to be cashed on at this point. So if we can just change onto the slides. This is a, this is a project which was done in Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, India. And we actually, being an implementing agency, wanted to see what kind of mitigations can be looked into for a certain ward, which we were looking at, and which was habitually flooded over the years. So the three questions that by this presentation I would like to take you through is why and how can citizen groups help in the urban flood management? Here I've used the word management very consciously because it's not all about mitigation, it's also about managing it. Why is it critical to take an ecosystem approach in urban flood management? I think this is a point that we captured in multiple ways in landscape planning and such in a big way. But here, when we talk about ecosystem approach, we talk about not only the environment, we talk not only about the biotic components, but the abiotic components also, the anthropogenic factors also. And that is what we are talking about, the ecosystem approach. And what are these alternative solutions which can help with stormwater infrastructure planning? Not sure whether this is working. Yeah. So just to quickly contextualize where we had done this, we had taken the watershed approach, of course, the Ushiwara River catchment area, and interestingly, something that Sahil also pointed in the morning, we had taken an electoral ward because being in the implementation agency, always being short of funds, we had to look at how funds could be mobilized. Flood is a very emotive issue which affects all the people. So electoral ward and, trying to find ways of using those electoral funds, the corporators' interest in the issue, and things like that was the reason why we took the electoral ward. The flood zones, as you see, we tried, this was primarily a residential and industrial land use. 60% of the land was under slums, but these slums are actually small mini industrial units that are working there, manufacturing units that are working there. Most of the formal development is along the arterial roads on higher plains, resulting in a very bowl-like formation happening in the middle, where there's a lot of industrial activity. There are channels, water channels, which are nalas, and which are seasonal in nature. Even the river is pretty seasonal in nature. And this is where the major amount of flooding happens. Why did we take the citizens with us? Because we wanted very sensitive data. As you would see, we had plotted the secondary data of where the flooding happens from multiple sources, and then we took the citizens' information and plotted it onto the ward, and we found that the flooding, which is generally assumed to be from the water bodies and things like that, were not necessarily so. It was not limited to that. There were a lot of local, very local issues that were resulting in increase of the flooding. After the intense precipitation, the aggravation of the flooding happens because of very local and contextualized issues. And these could be captured only because the people themselves were with us during this data collection. So we could find where, there were the cattle sheds and what kind of contribution they had there, where the water body had been completely, covered by a concrete slab, where normal activities were happening, where they had got diverted, and things like that could be captured very easily. So stakeholder observatories, as we call them, this is a terminology, citizen observatory, stakeholder observatory. It does not talk about only the citizen here. It also talks about the citizen scientists, it talks about the, the academia, the experts that are there, and it also, tries to bring in all that social learning together to fill in the gaps that are there in terms of technical data. So we bring in a lot of data from the ground by using all these sources of data together, and this is called social learning. So what we had done is we had mapped all the stakeholders, and we had again then grouped them based on what kind of role they had played during the floods, how informed were they about climate change, and what is their status in the socio fabric there, what is their roles in the social fabric there. And as you can see that we had not just handled the citizens, the private developers are mentioned there, the other consultants, the floating population, they were all reached out to. So how extensive you can be in this is what makes it more richer. The information and the data which comes in makes it more richer. This is Fung's Democracy Cube, which talks in similar lines, which says that from implicit data collection, the role of the citizen group or the stakeholder observatories can go into developing preferences, in deliberating and negotiating. At the same time, in terms of authority and power, from individual education, this can become a communicative influence. It can help in advising and consulting, co-governing, and things like that. Yeah. Who are these people who can form these stakeholder observatories? They are the citizens, the scientists, the volunteers, the trained volunteers, even our administration, local administration who we had reached out to, who had very rich information to share when we were doing the vulnerability assessment. The problem with this kind of social learning is that you are flooded with data, and then you don't know how to handle it, right? You have to then think about a structure of how you manage the data. And we took a very ecosystem-based approach, and as you can see, there was the environment and the ecosystem, the ecology, the stakeholder activities, the urban development, the provision of infrastructure, and the administration and governance all brought together. And these had, again, variables within them, a huge number of variables. And we tried to see which variable, how the variables relate between themselves, and how then these variables affect the vulnerability of the community, or the risks of flooding, aggravates the risk of flooding further. So if you see the stakeholder activities, there are, as we had heard in the morning, obstructing the drainage services, drainage systems, contaminating the water, blockages in the natural flow of the surface water because of the development, urban development, and so on. But it is also impacting the community in multiple ways. So that is how we tried to do a scoping and impact matrix. We have done a similar kind of a project on urban ecosystem management, and I'm just bringing it ahead, bringing it here because we had spoken about it. I think I'll just wind it up now. So, because this was mentioned in the morning by by multiple speakers, where it is a PSR framework of the OECD, where you talk about the state of the ecosystem and the pressures that are being created, which are leading to these vulnerabilities, and then how do you respond to them? What are the alternative solutions? I'll just run through these, because these are some that we had explored. from very decentralized sewage treatment for the vulnerable communities, because the contamination of water and the mixing of the sewage is one of the critical concerns which increases the vulnerability. We had looked at water parks and which are under construction and what they are trying to achieve, how water could be contained, because water drainage is often an issue in these kind of situations, because the nalas are already, flooded, and the discharge of water becomes very difficult, as we heard in the morning. So how do you hold on to the water for some time before you discharge it? And these are solutions which the community can own, and it just requires a lot of technical technical information transfer to them, and also awareness generation, intense awareness generation that can be handled with them, and they're ready to invest, they are ready to, they are, sorry. So they are ready to, take charge of it, be accountable for it, and own it. So these are the kind of solutions that we had looked into, the garbage, trash traps, in the stormwater systems and all. I think this is the end of it. These are those simple solutions that we had looked in, because we were part of the implementation agency and we had to see what could be done on the ground. And this is a snapshot of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sucharita. Just two issues which I think should be highlighted. One is the issue of scale. From talking about city at large, she is bringing in the issue of locality and how we can bring in citizens' participation directly, both not only as a part of assessing their vulnerability, but also as a solution space and solution givers. So thanks for that, Sucharita. We'll move to Rohit Majumda. And Rohit Majumdar is a planner and an architect who teaches at the Society for Environment and Architecture. His work is currently at least around the democratization of climate action plans. So hope that this conversation which Sucharita has started would get intensified through Rohit's presentation.
In the morning we heard Singapore, Bangkok, Tokyo, all of these cities have a lot to offer, a lot of lessons to offer. But is there something we can learn from Mumbai? And if so, what would that be? That's the question that I want to take up. Not as a provocation for a best practice to follow, but how might we start thinking from Mumbai as a place to think from in this presentation. So my work revolves around collecting stories of household experiences, responses, and innovations in the face of everyday wetness and its extreme events. We've been talking in the first session about short-term actions, medium-term actions, and long-term actions. I'd like to think about them in terms of everyday wetness, extreme events, to distinguish the flood risk from the risks and vulnerabilities of the everyday wetness, which pervades through the whole year in a majority of built form in Bombay. And simultaneously about the long term, which is a necessary thing that, as Sir has brought about in his presentation in the morning. So I want to make a distinction in this session between everyday and extreme events in this session. So my current and ongoing work revolves around ways of thinking, democratizing of climate action at the ward level, and I'm doing this work along with Nikhil Anand, who will also be a speaker, and a colleague, another colleague, Lalita Kamath. But that's a work that is going to happen. I'm going to talk about a previous work that three of us have been involved in on a project called as the Inhabited Sea. My work has focused largely on our ward, and I've been studying in different neighborhoods along our ward, which comprises of different kinds of build form, ranging from privately plotted bungalow schemes to town plan schemes to informal unplotted subdivisions, low-rise apartments, and high-rise apartments. How do households experience, respond to, and innovate in the face of everyday witness? The stories that we have gathered are available online on a website called as the Inhabited Sea, so all of y'all can look through it. So I won't get into the stories in detail because every story takes 5 minutes. I'm going to bring about some key points from some of these stories. What we did in collecting household experiences was that we mapped oral histories of around 50 years in these settlements. And one of the things that we realized is that flooding is not new. The earliest memory of the flood dates back to the 1960s. Its intensities have increased in the present moment. But there have been settlements along the floodplains of the river, and water has come in and water has gone out. So there has been an experience of flooding. Along the Daisa River, where this study is kind of conducted, which is a lesson spoken about river, as against the Mithi River, you had in the 1960s cattle sheds and an agrarian landscape that slowly transformed, in the case of this particular story, into an informal, unplotted subdivision. The cattle sheds gave way to migrant housing, low-income migrant housing on the river edge. And what is interesting is that if you see in this drawing, as well as the next one, so the top drawing and the lower drawing is of the then and the now. So the lower drawing has in the center a drainage line that has come through. The upper drawing does not have that, but it's a settlement with houses in a line which are along a street, and the street becomes a very important part of the house itself. For instance, if you see in this drawing, the house spills in a low-income settlement onto a street. The ground, therefore, is a very important thing over here. In the first instance, when the migrants, these two households that I've studied in this, when they came to stay over here, it was a one-story settlement. And over a period of time, and I won't get into these drawings, you can read all the details online if anybody is interested in this, but I want to make a quick point about the form of housing. Over the period of time, a mezzanine was added in the house. That mezzanine became the place to move to in the monsoon, and the ground became a place to come to in the summer. It worked climatically. It's a very interesting house type. So in this informal settlement, and informal settlements which are the most vulnerable settlements, somehow seem to be producing interesting build forms and housing types. And our only response to thinking about addressing build form for low-income settlements is through transfer of development rights or additional development rights into an apartment type, which ruins a hell lot of things. The point that I'm trying to make over here is that there is something about build form, and there is something about the relationship between the process of inhabiting the city and the build form. The process of inhabiting the city may produce vulnerabilities, but may also produce capabilities. And I completely agree with Sucharita when she speaks about a social learning being there in the process. But the important thing to kind of foreground over here is to link the process of inhabitation with the built form of inhabitation. That's my first point. So in this, you will actually go to see, this is a drawing that shows a house being drawn and a street being drawn during a flood. And those blue lines are actually the years in which the flooding has happened. And between 2005 to 2019, when the study was done, there were at least 9 floods that happened in this settlement, in spite of the new wall being built over here. That's my 5-minute call for myself. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So, it's flooded more than 9 times. One thing that happens is that when it floods, and if it floods below the mezzanine level, you move to the mezzanine. If not, you move to the public toilet. And if not the public toilet, this neighborhood school gives you access to stay in those days. The temple provides you with food, or the religious institution provides one with food. What I'm again trying to bring out over here is that there is an intricate social network that comes to address vulnerabilities, including the information system of how to become aware of the flood. The information to become aware of the flood in low-income settlements is at the moment river water starts coming into the gutters, you know that you have to start keeping your night watches. And so it is not only social media, but there's also a very different kind of information system that works on the ground. And that needs to be taken cognizance of. Okay. What does all of this point to? So in everyday wetness, you have a lot of vulnerabilities emerging from walls being wet through the whole year in low-income settlements, also leading to diseases and other things. And that's a very important thing. So while thinking about the long term, one needs to not lose sight of the shorter term and the actual everyday vulnerabilities that emerge in these settlements. Okay, I'm going to stop there with concluding just the last point. I'm done with this presentation. Again, I reiterate, if you want to see this presentation, it is there on the Inhabited Sea website. But the last point that I want to arrive at is that to address the problem of water, Ravi Punde in the morning mentioned that we need to start moving away from a language of crisis into thinking about, well, he opened the idea of the watersheds. What I'm thinking, I want to take it a little bit further, is to move beyond thinking of infrastructures to address the water, rather than that, think about how to adapt the built form of housing in place. And that might require conversations that emerge across different departments of the local state. So that's what I wanted to foreground.
Great presentation, Rohit. And I think this thing about the conversations between the local state, we see some parts of the local state here. There are other parts which perhaps still need to be brought into conversation, but I hope we will get there. And with that, we will move to Avinash Kaur. Avinash Kaur is an architect who works with the Transforming MWOD project of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And she brings a master's degree in urban design and has interests in both climate adaptability as well as in trying to work out solutions in partnership with urban poor communities.
Okay. Hi everyone. I hope the Cheetah Camp story, which I'll be talking about today, builds on everything which we were talking in the end of the first session and also continue towards the second session. So, why I'm talking about Cheetah Camp is because it's an excellent example of what we need to look and in times of flooding in smaller areas. For example, we need to look at intersections of water, sewerage and stormwater drain infrastructure, keeping in mind the existing topographical and hydrological conditions. And I hope this proves that it's an interesting example for whatever the discussions we are trying to have for Mumbai. This helps us in some fashion. Cheetah Camp, recently the flood happened in 2021, June in Cheetah Camp. If you can see, there are many local social networks which are already existing in Cheetah Camp who make each other aware of what kind of rain is happening, what kind of measures we need to take while it is happening, because the sense is that no one will come to help us in such a situation. So the story of Cheetah Camp starts in 1976. Cheetah Camp in 1975 was a marshy land, misfit for any kind of construction. Okay. In times of 1976 emergency, it was rehabilitated, resettled during a national emergency. BARC staff quarters which were built during that time were done by displacing 72,000 people from Janta colony, which today has become like the Cheetah Camp. So this was done by BMC. So if you can see, existing market area existed at that point in Cheetah Camp. If you see here, the BARC's hill, or the Trombe Hill, which we call, was the existing, like you can look through the existing Janta colony there. So Cheetah Camp today has like 11 sectors. Approximately 72,000 were displaced, 72,000 people were displaced at that point. And BMC in 76 had planned for 11 sectors to give them in Cheetah Camp. Approximately 660 households per sector, 25 to 30 gullies per sector, 20 to 24 households per gully was the division. In terms of services, there was a common block toilet which was given. Approximately 220 seats at that point were given. So existing with all of which had septic tank, because there was no sewer line at the time given. So that time, if you see, 327 was the people to toilet seat ratio. 120 is what is existing now. Water lines were provided, but only in 1992. After a lot of protest which happened from the citizen side to BMC. Stormwater drains also came with the water lines. Sewers didn't arrive until 20 years ago, but are yet to be connected to the main sewer line. So this also points us to one of the main things, that the infrastructure is also so fragmented that that also becomes one of the problems in the flooding situation. There were existing, since the area was marshy, the main road and the lowest point in Cheetah Camp has a 10-meter difference. So it slopes down towards the mangrove area. There were existing estuaries from Thane Creek, which existingly became part of the stormwater drain systems, where all the wastewater was led without treatment. So if you can see, these were the 3 estuaries which existed, and the purple line is the stormwater system. The pink line is the existing sewer system, which is not connected to any main drain, so it's very fragmented in that sense. There were existing freshwater wells, although the area was marshy. It was supposed to have salted water, but these wells were fresh water because it also acted as an aquifer. So there was fresh water which came, and people used, until the time they did not get water lines, people used these wells for their drinking water purposes. And right now, if you see, the wells are not being like that much of use. They have also deteriorated over the years because of construction. So there was one whole building which was constructed on a well. There was a well which is, the water is so bad that it cannot be used for any purpose now, and the condition is deteriorating every year. So there are existing common toilets, which I said were connected to the septic tanks. There was a peripheral drain system, partially connected sewage lines, unconnected, all of that. If you can see, this is a estuary, which was in 1975, this stormwater drain. So that was converted into the, so concretization was done to convert into a drain. So existingly, it looks like this. There are parts of sewer line constructed, which I was talking about. So this is like the main section or cross section, if I can talk about. Existingly, this is the main drain, which I was talking, has been converted from an estuary to the stormwater drain. Toilets directly are connected to this drain because they don't, individual toilets, people did not have an option but to construct individual toilets in the community and connect it to the stormwater drain because there were no sewer lines. Other option which they had was the septic tanks, but the septic tanks were also let into the central gully or drain which existed because the septic tank also flooded when the area was so marshy that water from the ground was also let into the septic tanks and which overflowed over the years, flooding people's house. So households at lower levels, some households are at lower levels than the existing gully. This is because the people, so the gully is constructed like every alternate year. Because as an option to avoid flooding, but that is not happening. The house now floods because the gully is above and the house is below. In cases of reconstruction, some people like construct 900 mm above the ground so as to stop their house from flooding. So this is like the main, if I say, a stormwater sewerage connection and all of this infrastructure, even as BMC, if we're looking at it as we are different departments, but on ground, if we see, this is a very interconnected system, which because of which flooding can happen and also flooding can be avoided. So mainly, I would like to talk about how the community is resilient to this and what kind of adaptations they are trying to make. For them, flooding is non-solvable. They keep minimal furniture on ground floor. Construction of gully is only imagined as the only solution. That is also because that's the only demand they can make to the MLA or the corporation. Cleaning maintenance is difficult, as we have discussed, that there are many cables, water lines, toilet or septic tank overflow connections to these. Citizens at points have also tried to clean the drains themselves because they have no option. Multiple calls to the BMC is also left unheard at times. So the only question I'm trying to pose here is, will an integrated system approach can help us deal with wastewater, water and sanitation? Do we have such kind of solution? Can Cheetah Camp be a demo site? Also, can this vicious circle, if we say it's a circle of all the infrastructure connected to each other, can be turned into a virtuous circle? Like we revive the wells, we revive the existing estuaries in the matter. Okay, thank you.
So thanks, Avinash. I think again at the scale of a locality, but also a locality which is primarily inhabited by poorer people. And we see fragmented actions. I think the other interesting point of this case study is fragmented actions conducted by one single agency, which is the Bombay Municipal Corporation. Cheetah Camp is a creation of the Bombay Municipal Corporation. All its facilities, everything, because it's a resettlement. And therefore, I think it is important to understand how we could work in isolation, even in this kind of a locality. There are several others where there are issues of governance, like one agency constructs, another owns the land, and so on and so forth. But in this case, all of it is contained within one agency. So one needs to think of how departments can come into conversation once again, and particularly these three departments, which I think are critical. We can also add others to them. With this, we will move to Roshni Nugehalli, who is the Executive Director of, I think, one of the most important from point of view of a discourse civil society organizations in the city of Mumbai, which is YUVA, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. And I think the kind of thinking, the critical thinking that Yuva has promoted in several sectors of the city is definitely something that all of us can take inspiration from. Over to you, Roshni.
Thank you, Amita. That is very kind, but I think we've worked with you to do a lot of this critical thinking, and yeah, thanks. I think very interesting 4 or 5 presentations so far, which have really gone local and really challenged perhaps the lens in which we are looking at the flooding and the solution. And maybe it's interesting that I'll try to perhaps draw some of that together into maybe some sort of a framework. Sorry, okay, I have to be very gentle, it is difficult. Okay, I think what I want to just little bit start out with very quickly is every year we get a reminder, the southwestern monsoon, the reminder, I think really is that, the sea and the rivers are reminding us that today's city once belonged to them. And I think Mr. Velarasu, you spoke in the morning of Vaishnavi Chandrasekhar's article in The Atlantic, which she refers to this, that I think it's just important for us to reflect on that. And even what Professor Punde spoke in the morning of looking at a watershed ecosystem sort of a lens, I think that is important to just keep in the back of our minds that this is actually also a land of the water. And of course we respond. From the morning we've been hearing a slew of technical solutions, whether it's drainage, we know about the desilting, precautionary measures people take. Professor Majumda really spoke very eloquently about local knowledge and how that's used. And also people tolerate it. We know it's for 3 months, we're not a Singapore, we're not a London, so we move on. And I think what maybe the question we need to do now and why we're all here these 2 days and particularly for the MCGM to be hosting this, I think is really we want to move to take the response from short-term, quick fixes, which we need to do, very critical, no doubt, but also start looking at longer and holistic vulnerability assessment. I think that's why we're all here. And I think it's very important that we're having this conversation. Before we start, I think it's important to frame vulnerability, we have, whether it's interesting, we haven't referred much to it, whether it's the Mumbai disaster management plan, whether it is a Maharashtra plan, there are several definitions of vulnerability. And informal settlements are covered in that definition, when we've all been speaking of informal settlements in this session. So really, I think 2 questions. I mean, one question is what does vulnerability mean to those who are actually vulnerable? And Kavita, you also brought up that where we need to have these conversations, not just, I think, in these rooms. So if we look at who are the most vulnerable, definitely those in the informal space, whether it's informal livelihoods, whether it's informal habitation, definitely the vulnerable. But also, I think, how do we approach them? Invisibility is there, but also this sense of they being the problem. The encroachments on the river, or there is too much density, there are too many people. 60% of people are actually living on only, 20% of the land. So I think this whole framing as invisible and illegal also is important because they end up being the most vulnerable. And of course, inadequacy of habitat. Not just places like Cheetah Camp, places like the Poisar and the Oshiwara River belts, but also built structures. We hear every year in the monsoons also of 7, 8 floor buildings collapsing because they are not, adequately, the foundations are weakening and there isn't enough action taken. So I think little bit expanding that notion as well, that habitat and those who are on the streets, the homeless are completely in another very, very marginalized category. Additionally, I think looking at those who get disrupted and displaced, and I think for that, we need to look at the region. While, of course, we have a Mumbai cap, but the environment, like Amita just said, is not administratively bound. In the Navi Mumbai airport, we know what ecosystems are being destroyed there, and many people's lives are being destroyed. So all of that is going to impact on Bombay as well. Similarly, in Vasai Virar, there are these huge 5 infrastructure projects which will displace 50,000 families. This is bigger than many of the slums in Bombay, and this is all documented. So I think looking at who gets disrupted and who gets displaced also become a big part of who are the vulnerable. And then I want to use this word peripheries. I think in technical language, we use hazard prone, spatiality. Of course, I'm not an expert, but I think the word periphery is not just geographic peripheries as in, the edges of the city or peri-urban, but the peripheries of building on a slope because you have nowhere else to go. building in a landslide-prone area, building right next to the, the BARC, building along the river. So yes, it becomes a problem for the city, but the vulnerability also arises from a certain location. So I think maybe we need to start re-looking at the way we approach these groups. And also, how are they vulnerable? We've had lots of conversations on household level impact, but I think, I'm going really slow. Oh, okay. We should really look at loss and damage, which we are not calculating. And I think that is very, very critical. We don't know how much people are losing and what is happening. How do we calculate that in both economic and social and psychological terms, and assets and power come into that. And of course, impacts on public services, and I don't only mean transport, whether it is health, how much the health system will have to bear because people are forever ill during the monsoons, what happens to the education system, and of course, maladaptation, the walls that we talk about, we all know those stories. Also, opportunity costs. How much are people losing out just in order to meet the needs of the flood? So I think vulnerability, we need to look at it as intersectional, entrenched, and also intensifying, and it will continue to intensify. So I think what I would like to propose is this whole idea of flood management as vulnerability informed. This is, just a coinage. It's not anything. I mean, we can talk about it, but I think resilience to the event is crucial. No doubt about it. But it ultimately starts placing a burden on a wire fence solution. Let's widen the stormwater drain. Let's make sure that the catchment is cleared. And also people's adaptive capacity. Let's move up, or let's do something. But we need to move forward to look at a justice framework. If we are really if we're serious about talking about vulnerability, where we need to have direct efforts at addressing the social vulnerabilities which intersect with the climate vulnerabilities. That includes housing. That includes what happens to the waste in my house. That includes sanitation, health, livelihood. I mean, we can go on and have a long conversation. Tomorrow, my colleague will speak about the Bharatnagar landslide on 18th July. But the grey infrastructure that you can see there was completely useless. What were the deeper causes of deforestation on the BARC hill, where 20 people lost their lives? Is greening a solution? And then this will keep happening. The wall has been built again. Similar things are going to happen. So can we talk about adequate alternatives which center people's dignity? I think that's really the question. And what is the participation of that group? Even today, just the wall has been built. There is absolutely no conversation beyond some compensation. So I think centering, if we want to be vulnerability involved, we really need to center, I think, people's things. And this process will be cyclical. We have to do anticipatory adaptive planning, definitely. We have to do reducing risk during the event. I think as a corporation, as a city, we do these two. We know we have to do them, and we do them, good or bad, we can converse. But what about 3 and 4? If we want to do vulnerability assessments, we need to look at the ability to bounce back. If I have lost 3 months due to poor health, if my child, has been sick with diarrhea, even I've lost a life, how will I bounce back? And then through IPC and other sources, we're really talking about bounce forward. We can, of course, debate the terminology, but what next? Are we going to always be here, or can we at some point move beyond this cyclical process? And this, I think, is the framework with which, if we can start looking at flood management in the city, it'll be really helpful. And I will just end here. I want to, because again, I think it's important for us to ride on things that are already popular, like the SDGs and the Leave No One Behind. So I think, to me, if we are looking at vulnerability-informed flood management, it means leaving no one behind, which is, India is committed to, the state is committed to. So we need assessments which are spatial, of course, which we are very good at doing, we saw in the morning, but also qualitative. And further, we need to partner with groups on the ground. We need to start doing in this city and country also empirical loss and damage calculations to guide the compensation or rehabilitation. I think we are completely absent in this. And leverage existing knowledge. I think many speakers in the morning have spoken about that, and also networks. That would be very important as one bucket. I think the other bucket, again, to use a term which the government likes, mainstreaming. We need to look at any response to flood as not a standalone. It needs to be integrated not just into the planning, but also all the line departments, which I think we have been emphasizing from the morning. Health, every program of health needs to integrate flood risk, and not only during the 3 months. Every program of education, what about solid waste management? Really start integrating them. That will require a capacity building agenda, no doubt. It will require us to build our knowledge, but definitely. And finally, look at local decentralized structures that converge all of this. I mean, I appreciate that we are going to have an app where I can tell that, okay, tomorrow, my Basti ka Galli number 4 is going to get flooded. But if it's, again, just up to me to go figure out what I'm going to do during that flood, then is that enough? What about the social contract that the state does have with me? So I think if we can look at decentralized structures where these things converge, I think there's, this is what we should prioritize. And finally, of course, Amita is the expert, but, transforming governance with stakeholders' participation, and hopefully these decentralized structures on the ground can provide that space. So everybody doesn't have to come and meet the AMC. We have health posts, we have ward officers, we have Anganwadi supervisors. We can do a lot of this, ASHA workers at the local level. And look at social protection measures in response to, as core to flood vulnerabilities. COVID as a disaster happened, we all did social protection measures. This state government announced a slew of measures. Why are we not looking at floods, which is part of the climate-induced disasters, and looking at social protection for floods, which includes compensation, pensions, wages, education, death loss. So not just yahan flood hua, what do we do there? But look at it as a much larger picture. I think this is a broader question, but definitely it's something to consider. And at the same time, mechanisms for feedback and accountability. Without that, we can't manage. And for public, of course, but also for the private sector. So if we need money coming in, and that's not in maybe our control, yes, people will put in money from other sectors. But then as long as there are feedback mechanisms for accountability, then I think we will be more than happy to support that. And of course, a big elephant in the room, what about these antithetical projects? You have your big roads which are running across the sea and others, how do we place that? I mean, it's not for us to perhaps discuss here, but they will exist. And they will continue to deepen whatever existing processes and vulnerabilities exist. So I think looking at it as people, making sure the last person is reached, looking at mainstreaming this process beyond 1 or 2 departments and making it a part of our thinking, and looking at how every single person has a voice, but can also question in a way that is impactful, not just raising a voice and nobody hears me. I think these are some things that maybe we could discuss.
Thank you, Roshni, for that extremely important framing from a justice perspective and what you termed as a vulnerability-informed assessment and framework. I think this session leaves us perhaps with a lot of questions which are not usually asked. Okay? So what I'm going to do is, we have about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion, but rather than having a generic discussion, I'm going to encourage all the engineers and the municipal personnel to actually respond, ask, comment, give feedback, because I think we need to trigger that conversation, and your reactions, all your reactions are welcome.
I think all of the speakers were excellent. I'm Neville Mehta from Mumbai first. So I'm working in the field that I work. I'm trying to bring something, a different angle on the table, and that being governance. I mean, we had Kavita talking about what she experienced when she was a young girl. She's young now too, but 20 years down the line, she says that she still braces the same problems, or she's still looking for the same problems, or maybe reporting some problems like this elsewhere. So we're talking about now, I'm bringing on the table just governance, because there's so much of work that all of us have done, so much of data, so much of lives. I mean, if you put each one's man hours that individually we have put in, there is, I mean, I don't think we have a calculator to account for it. So data is there. Absolutely, women, man, sorry, whatever. But the question is, we as a nation are very fortunate that we are a population of resilient citizens. You throw anything to the citizens and we get out of it. If it was COVID, with the help of the excellent management of the MCGM, and of course, the local ALMs and everybody, we came out of it, and whatever the world would say, India showed, the resilience of the country, its citizenship, and its systems. Thereafter, after this whole day's discussion, I'm becoming even more confident that we need to have an institutional framework. I mean, like we say that, there are different departments, of course, all involved, but with every discussion, we are coming to a stage where we feel we have the knowledge, we have the equipment, we have the technology, but we're not being able to take care of it and solve the problem at ground level. The problem still exists. Maybe it's less extreme, but it's still there, it's not gone. So that's something that I'm getting more confident. But we need to bring in a behavioral change, sir, in our way of dealing with the problems, from reactiveness to proactiveness. What we do is wait for it to happen, and then we react with saying we should do this, we should do that, we should do that. But if our management systems should turn into proactiveness, then we are trying to envisage what the problem is, because we already all know what the problem is, but how to deal with the problem. And if this forum is established to become more proactive, then it will serve the purpose that we have met. So I don't want to bring anything technical on the table. What I'm trying to bring in is the form of governance of something that would actually reap benefits, starting with the low-hanging fruits and then motivating us to get to the higher ground. That's where I conclude. Thank you.
मराठीत बोलू थँक्यू अच्छा फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल सॉरी सुरुवातीला मी सगळ्यांचे आभार मानतो की तुम्ही लोक इथे मोठ्या संख्येने आलात आणि महानगरपालिकेबद्दल विविध मतं सगळ्यांनी मांडली पण सगळ्यात पहिले मी सांगू इच्छितो की मी अतिशय प्राऊड फील करतो की मी महानगरपालिकेचा एम्प्लॉई आहे त्याच्यानंतर सगळ्यात मोठी गोष्ट आणि कौतुकाची गोष्ट आहे की मी मिठी नदी प्रकल्प हँडल करतो कारण कसं आहे त्या सगळ्यात मोठा चर्चेचा विषय असतो डेफिनेटली आणि सगळ्यात क्रिटिसिझमचा विषय असतो पण आम्ही म्हणजे ऑब्वियसली आहे की आमचे चीफ इंजिनियर आहेत DMC सर आहेत AMC सर आहेत की हा विषय ना हा विषय जेव्हा पण फ्लड येतं ना त्या सगळ्यात जास्त तुम्ही म्हणता ना वल्नरेबल मोस्ट अफेक्टेड वी आर द अफेक्टेड ट्रस्ट मी कारण वी आर गेटिंग द पेन इन स्पाइट ऑफ स्पेंडिंग our sleepless 24/7 of work and we are giving our best of the services, we are using our best of the knowledge, but still whenever it is getting flooded, yes we get a pain because we are also Mumbaikars, we are also staying in the same city and even my daughter is also asking that when it is getting sorted out. So obviously we are also affected parties. Secondly, under the leadership of great our AMCP sir, we found it he learned a subject as an engineer and he understood the technicality of subject and he taught us the technicality. He know this is the way. Trust me, I as a personally I learn a lot under his leadership because he studied each and every bits of that subject. ते प्रत्येक ह्याच्यात बारकाईमध्ये जातात ते डिटेलमध्ये स्टडी करतात ते सोशल ॲस्पेक्ट स्टडी करतात ते फायनान्शियल ॲस्पेक्ट स्टडी करतात ते त्याच्यातला टेक्निकल ॲस्पेक्ट स्टडी करतात सॉरी नाही ठीक सर तर मॅडम इथे फक्त एक तुम्हाला सांगायचं माझं असं एक मत आहे की ऑब्वियसली हा जो विषय आहे स्पेसिफिकली हा टेक्निकल सब्जेक्ट आहे फ्लड मॅनेजमेंट हा टेक्निकल सब्जेक्ट आहे पण त्याचबरोबर सोशल ॲस्पेक्ट आणि एन्व्हायरमेंटल ॲस्पेक्टसुद्धा कन्सिडर करायला पाहिजे जे आम्ही आता करतो आहे असं नाही आहे की आम्ही नाही करत आहे उद्या मोस्टली आम्ही मिठी रिव्हरबद्दल एक प्रेझेंटेशन पण देऊ की ज्याच्यात आम्ही हे पण सांगू की आम्ही गेल्या 5 वर्षांमध्ये 6 वर्षांमध्ये आम्ही कसं हे वेगवेगळे विषय त्याच्यात इंटिग्रेट करतो आहे तर ते एक तुमच्यासमोर मांडायचं होतं आणि त्याचबरोबर ऑब्वियसली लोकांचा पण सहभाग हवा आहे कारण बरेचसे विषय असे आहेत की जे सोशल आहेत आणि ते सोशली सॉल्व करायला लागतील त्यात सगळ्यांचं इनपुट्स येणं फार गरजेचं आहे आणि ह्या प्लॅटफॉर्मवरून जे काही मान्यवर आम्हाला सपोर्ट करतील तर ते अजून आम्हाला पुढे ज्यावरती डिसिजन घ्यायला इझी पडेल थँक्यू
practical ticket visually scope आता. All nalas are enclosed by slums. There is no access to maintain and clean. While working, थोड़ा difficulties हमारा काम करता नहीं होता. It is very difficult to get done the work. आता आपण असं बोललात की it is very important social factors. जैसे कि मॅडम बोलले आफ्टर फ्लडिंग काही जे प्रॉब्लेम होतात त्यांना रिहॅब करायचं किंवा कम्पेन्सेशन अशी पॉलिसी बनायला पाहिजे. पण इट इज अंडर प्रोसेस नो फायनल झालेलं नाही आहे. पण एक सांगायचं असं आहे की काम करताना जे अडचणी येतात त्याच्यावरती मात करून आम्ही सर्व हे कामं करतो. आणि इट इज अ टीम वर्क right from sub-engineer up to MC sir. So we work in get our situation on site. So the reports are very important to us. We take into consideration while planning our next meetings. Thanks, sir.
I'll speak. I think this session was the audio.
It's on.
Yeah. So this afternoon session was what I would say. I would say they touch new dimensions which is not our area. Basically, whenever we talk about flooding, it is handled by our stormwater drainage department, which is purely engineering department. So we have engineering framework, right? So we have engineering framework, we have different committees, different reports, we have the technical background, so we approach from a engineering perspective. I think this session is important because it brings on the table other dimensions which are so far not touched, right? The social aspects, the vulnerability aspect, how to protect them, how to have a holistic plan. These are the new frameworks. Of course, in the long run, we have to develop on all these aspects, the social framework, how somebody talked about dignity of life to these people. Somebody said the organic interconnectivity between the different elements like the temple, maybe I think you spoke to that. So all these aspects should be coming in the newer framework. Now we have to talk and discuss how to bring it in the BMC system, because that is not the mandate of the stormwater drainage department as such. But maybe we have to go beyond that. We have to create new structures where like the climate filter, morning minister was talking, whatever work you do, put a climate filter. Maybe you might have to put it through a social filter. Most of the international organizations, they do it very well. Maybe the World Bank, other international funders, they always put through all these filters. Because we are spending, so we want to spend the engineering way. And so it's not that we are insensitive, but we are not touch that aspect very consciously. That is one thing. Second thing is, I won't say the vulnerable groups, everything is right. So there are a lot of encroachments, there are a lot of illegalities. So okay. Now, like he said, most of the places there are a lot of encroachments. Okay, and it is a mix. So there are eligible people, there are not eligible people. Some projects they are eligible till 2000, some projects they are eligible after 2011. Okay, and so there are many legal aspects are also involved. So you can't say all vulnerable group, they are all rosy picture. No, it's not like that. So it's a mixed picture. You should have a mechanism to separate also. And then the third question I just want to leave it for discussion is, it is always not necessary the state should step in to protect the vulnerable. If you see the US, if you see all these reports, whatever maybe all this Katrina and all other things, they have their own insurance. I'm just questioning, I'm not saying why these people can't purchase insurance. Do we have a flood risk insurance market? So why don't you think about that? Okay, why can't you purchase an insurance? And why can't private sector step in? Why can't you ask the government to only create an enabling mechanism? When you talk about Singapore, we always pull out Singapore, Tokyo. So how much consultative process they have done while developing Singapore? So the Lee Kuan Yew system, you should know how much consultative process they have gone through while developing this system. They did a perfect planning, but I don't know how much consultative it was. So, yeah? Yeah, it's possible. I am not aware. So I don't know how much they have done the consultative process. But the point I'm raising is, it is not always the state which has to take care of these things. There can be alternative mechanisms. You can bring in a private player. There can be other markets for this developed. But in the long range, what most of you touch the cheetah camp and other experiences. So I think it is well taken note of. Maybe we have to develop a larger framework other than the engineering framework. Maybe there is lots of homework to do. Yeah, that's what I feel. Yeah.
टू रिस्पॉन्सेस. पहिला मराठीमध्ये बोलतो. म्हणजे माझं म्हणण्याचं हे अर्थ होतं माझ्या प्रेझेंटेशनमध्ये, जे स्टॉर्म वॉटर ड्रेनेज डिपार्टमेंटवरती रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी किंवा ब्लेम येतं, ॲक्च्युली त्याचं सोल्युशन दुसरं कुठचं तरी डिपार्टमेंट सॉल्व करू शकतं. ह्या प्रकाराने बघा, कारण का त्याचं सोल्युशन तुमच्या डिपार्टमेंटमध्ये नसणार. चेंज काय करायला पाहिजे? आपलं बिल्ड फॉर्म चेंज करायला पाहिजे. तर तुम्ही प्रश्न विचारले पाहिजे दुसऱ्या डिपार्टमेंटला की आपण हे वेगळ्या प्रकाराने सॉल्व करू शकतो, इन्स्टेड ऑफ टेकिंग द रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी ओनली ऑन द स्टॉर्म वॉटर ड्रेनेज डिपार्टमेंट. आय थिंक दॅट इज वेअर आय वॉज ट्राईंग टू गेट ॲट in terms of the conversation, not put the blame on you. I think maybe it came across as that way. So I was speaking about collaboration between departments in that way. What is conventionally seen as a problem of your department may emerge as a solution by talking to another department, and a responsibility that evolves in that collaboration. That's number one. Number two, no, I mean, again, in the responses that are emerging, we're again going back to numbers. Numbers and calculations are things that we can't seem to get out of. And it is important that we try to kind of, go a little bit beyond that. There are questions in thinking about responding to vulnerabilities. There are questions of design sensibilities, number one, which move beyond calculations of numbers. So I really like the proposition that you made in the morning regarding what we can do in terms of a response to, but you use the strategy of the TDR. What emerges if you go onto the ground is that there are immense capacities of repairs and retrofitting. Can that become a model? Can that become a model to think about going beyond TDR? Because I came out of my presentation, and if I would have showed you one slide, there's a whole neighborhood within which in low-rise buildings, plots with bungalows which built in the 1960s turned into low-rise apartments in the 1980s, and then post-2005 into high-rise apartments with double stilt levels to accommodate the water to come down from. Okay? Now, there are, in fact, for all one building built, there are at least 10 buildings that can't get redeveloped over there. And they can't get redeveloped for several reasons. Number one, because of the claims that may be on land or on property, which are multiple, including within the family. Number two, demonetization pushed redevelopment in a very different spin. And then RERA, followed by the pandemic, pushed several projects of the lot. So what happens is that a whole lifetime goes and redevelopment does not occur. But in the meantime, if you see, there are immense local capacities in neighborhoods towards repair and retrofitting. Can that become a model to think about in the future. So that is where I was getting at. So while thinking innovatively, the proposition that you gave in the morning, could it be worked around repairs and retrofits?
Can I ask a quick question? Is there a way that we can just do away with this idea of an eligibility date at all? Because going forward, I mean, when things are going to be, when more and more people will be vulnerable, and when extreme events will be more, even more extreme and more frequent, those who are ineligible for any kind of rehabilitation right now, they don't disappear. They ultimately go back into another region that is even more vulnerable, and they become even more vulnerable. So this whole concept, as you said, since you're considering a new framework and a wider framework of what the BMC what the BMC's role may be at a time when more regions of the city are flooding even constantly, like a permanent wetness, as he's talking about. What then would the BMC's role be if there are going to be so many more people who are constantly vulnerable? It's just egregious that there is a thing called an eligibility date to live, to survive.
I'm not going to allow anybody to respond to this question, Kavita, because I think we should conclude this discussion with first saying, should vulnerability always be equated to eligibility? Okay? And that there is something to vulnerability which is beyond eligibility as well. So all people who are ineligible are not necessarily illegal, or they are not necessarily non-vulnerable. So I think that is something that let us recognize. I think the second frame that let us conclude this discussion with is to say that it is not a matter of adding the social at some point in time to the engineering, but it is trying to imagine engineering also in a different way when we take in considerations of the social. And perhaps that is something with which we can conclude this already delayed session, going for a short tea break.
Amita, can I just say something?
Sorry, who is this?
Ravi here. Ravi here, Ravi. Yeah. No, this is something to what Roshni was saying, and I think might be an interesting idea to conclude on. Exactly, don't worry. I know I have a habit of stretching, but still. I think it might be, Roshni, based on what you were saying about dignity, bringing dignity to the whole community that we're talking about. Maybe in these sessions we need to drop two words, right? One is informal and the other is slums. Let's replace it with normal and replace it with urban vernacular. I think that's why we will begin to give dignity. Our way of thinking about these things will change. That's all.